Hi all, Jake here. Now, with all this election stuff going on, there's a question that I'm sure has crept across some of your minds lately, which is how do they count all these ballots? I mean, in order to get an accurate count, you have to somehow count up hundreds of thousands and in many states even millions of ballots, and you have to do this all in a fairly timely manner. So, what does it actually take to get this operation done? It's not really that simple. Now, I was curious about this myself, so I did some research, and what I found was pretty fascinating. As a matter of fact, different states have different approaches to tackling this problem. So, in this video, I'm going to relate to you some of these methods that these states employ in order to count all their ballots up. Now, the 12 states you see on your screen right now employ what is called the 100 stacks method. Basically, here's how it works. The counting booth has hundreds of employees, bordering on 1,000 employees. So there are a lot of people involved in this operation, and that's needed in order to count such a high number of ballots. So the way this works is rather simple. You have one layer, the most populated layer, the most people working there, that count up ballots for each candidate and put them in stacks until they reach a stack of 100. Once they reach a stack of 100, they hand that off to the next layer. Now the next layer will take stacks of 100 and until they reach 100 of them, i.e. 10,000 votes. So they have this bundle of 10,000 votes that they hand off to the third layer. Now the third layer counts up 100 of these bundles, and then that would be 1,000,000 votes for that candidate. As you might imagine, the first layer is the most populated, second layer doesn't need as many people, and the third layer needs very few people. So by divvying up the work like this, it actually doesn't take that many people to count up the ballots correctly, and it's a pretty good method to quickly get an accurate assertion of how many votes each candidate has. Now, sometimes you'll have a worker who will stop everyone in their tracks and ask them what number they're on, and then the tabulator adding up all their reports. And this is how you get more exact numbers of how many votes each candidate has at a given moment. That's how you're able to get minutely updates on Google of how many votes each candidate has. Now, these 9 states employ a very similar method called 60 stacks. Basically, instead of stacks of 100, they only go up to 60. And the next layer only goes up to 60. So instead of powers of 100, you're dealing with powers of 60. That's the only difference, and it's kind of weird, but basically what you get is a little bit more precision. So if one stack is miscounted, it's not as big of a deal as if a stack of 100 is miscounted, for instance. In exchange for taking slightly more time and needing slightly more people. I think it's a fair trade-off for the states that employ this method, though. Now, these 7 states use a very primitive method of counting. Basically, there's only one person counting all the ballots, and he'll look at the ballot. He has 2 buttons in front of him. The left button's for one candidate, right button's for another. And he'll press the button according to which candidate the ballot's for, and then put them in the pile. And he just keeps doing this. The button is hooked up to a counter for each candidate, and that will give you an exact number of votes for each candidate. It's quite simple, but obviously this takes a lot of time, and if you notice, these states happen to be ones that took a while to report their numbers, and that's why. Now, if the person counting messes up and accidentally presses the wrong button, he has to call a manager over, and the manager will rectify the issue by decreasing the counter by 1. And then the guy will actually be replaced by another person who's less tired or prone to error or whatever the problem may be. Now, these 5 states actually use some pretty sophisticated technology. We have AI image recognition software that works pretty fast, and this sort of image recognition is how we, for example, use scantrons in school. The same thing can be applied to ballots. You don't need too sophisticated of an algorithm to detect which candidate someone marked off on their ballot. So they can feed the ballots through the system en masse and very quickly tally up the number of votes each candidate got. And if you notice, the states that employ this method, most notably California, which is the home of Silicon Valley, where this technology came from, they were able to report their numbers very fast after their polls closed. And this is how they're using computers to their advantage. All right, now there are two states that use a sort of similar method, but that kind of differs in a major way. So they have a team of people take the ballots, and based on which candidate the ballot is for, they'll mark it with a special tag. And then they put all the ballots on a conveyor belt that moves pretty fast and scans through all the tags and adds them up. The technology it uses is almost the same as a fob, for instance, and it works pretty well. So I'm surprised more states don't use this, and I'm interested to see if more states in the future decide to replace their methods with this one. Now, there is a solution to this counting problem that's quite simple, and once you hear it, you'll be like, I can't believe I thought of this sooner. But these 6 states actually employ it. So what they do is they get someone called the stack man, and the stack man basically takes all the ballots for a particular candidate and makes sure that the ballots are completely aligned in a nice even stack. Then another person called the measure man takes a very delicately graduated ruler, like not a normal ruler that you would use, a very specialized instrument, and actually measures the height of the ballots. And if you take the height and then just divide out the width of one ballot, you have the number of ballots, and that's a very fast way to count hundreds of thousands and even millions of ballots. You may be concerned that you can sort of change the height of a stack of paper. And in fact, in the election of 1972, there was a scandal where someone apparently sat on the stack before measuring it to try to make the number lower. So now there are rules in place and security on site to make sure that none of that funny business ever happens. They're just placed in the stack and then ordered by the stack man. All right, that stack man is very important. Now, this next method, which these 3 states use, is also similarly very simple, but kind of difficult to think of on the first try. So essentially, all they do is they take the ballots, they organize them by candidate, and then they put them in giant burlap sacks. And then they tie a string around the burlap sack and hook them up to a large spring scale that's set up in a specialized facility to weigh them. Yeah, basically they just weigh the ballots, and based on the weight, divide by the weight of one ballot, and bam, you have your number of ballots for that candidate. Obviously, you also have to account for the weight of the burlap sack, so that's taken into account. They're not dumb. This is a super fast, easy, and efficient way to count up all those ballots. Now, you may be concerned that no scale is that precise, but this is the government we're talking about. They obviously have access to very sophisticated instruments that let them measure to the degree of precision they need. Otherwise, they would never get away with measuring ballots like this. That wouldn't make any sense. Now, the next method is sort of in the same vein as the previous two, but it takes a little bit more setup. Basically, they have giant graduated tanks full of water. And a team of people will, of course, using the bottom of the meniscus, not the top, measure how much water is in the tank. And then what they do is they take all the ballots for a candidate, dunk them in the tank, and then however much the volume increased, you divide out the volume of one ballot, and bam, that's your number. So it's pretty simple. It kind of can make recounts a little tricky. That's why in these states, recounts can take a while. They have to wait for the ballots to dry out. But the ballots are actually made with a specialized waterproof paper. I don't know if anyone knew this, but it's not just normal paper. It's waterproof paper specifically so that they can count them this way. This method is called the Archimedean method. So there are two states that use a very interesting approach. Essentially, they have two metal plates with a specific area, and they squeeze all the ballots in between these two metal plates. The plates are then hooked up to a specialized RC circuit with a known resistance value and that takes unit amplitude input. With this hookup, you're able to take some current measurements and then solve for the capacitance of the system. And of course, with that capacitance, you have a known permittivity of the material used for the ballots. You have a known area of the metal plates, so all you have to do is solve for d, the distance between the two plates, and bam, there's only one number of ballots that can produce that exact distance. So they use electricity essentially to count the number of ballots that each candidate got, which I think is a pretty genius way to go about the problem. Now, lastly, these three states use the incantation method. They take a Native American shaman and he utters a very specialized election incantation. And the ritual involves the ballots laying out in front of the shaman. And after the incantation is uttered, a gust of wind will blow and leave imprinted in the dirt the exact number of ballots that each candidate got. And I know what you're thinking. That's ridiculous. This could never work. But in the election of 1952, they actually tried this method in addition to actual counting, and they compared the results, and indeed, the results were exactly the same. The numbers imprinted in the dirt by the wind via the shaman's incantation were exactly the numbers that were manually counted. So, I mean, it works, and if something works, why not use it? Personally, I think we are blessed to have Native Americans in this country who are willing to do such a useful service for us. All right, guys, that's all 50 states and Washington, D.C. And that's how they all count their ballots. So I hope this video was informative, and I hope you learned something new from it. And please, if a question like this ever comes up, do your own research and you'd be surprised at what you might find. So take care. Please subscribe to the channel for more informative content like this, and have a nice evening.